So tonight we have Tim O'Brien, and he's a photograph extraordinaire, along with John Hart. John Hart's with us tonight too. John. And I asked, I did not make the steam up in July. I'm really kicking myself for not going, but I thought, well, since I can't go, I know I can get some good photographs of the steam up. But we're going to see a lot more than that tonight, I'm pretty sure. I had a little bit of a preview of what he's going to show us. Tim, you're on.
Thank you very much, Dan.
I'll do mine. Okay.
Everybody hear me okay? So to adequately cover all the doings that the Railroad Museum is doing would be like a 6, 7, 8 hour program. What Dan asked me to do was to give you a timeline of engine number 5, which is our most prized accomplishment in the 37 years we've been in business at the Railroad Museum. And so we're going to go from its creation in 1875 all the way up through today, and its many changes and the many things that we've been able to do, thanks to a lot of sponsors and volunteers and so forth. So I'm not going to get real technical, and I'm not going to get overly historic, because we'll get into 2 or 3 hours, as opposed to the time Dan allotted me. But the nice thing is that we have Museum Director John Christensen here. We have Restoration Manager Dan Lloyd here. We have Track Maintenance and Museum Basic Director Dana Milner here. And all these people can answer questions and get to the nitty-gritty. I'm going to also ask for a show of hands. How many of you been to the Railroad Museum down on Post Avenue? Fantastic. And it's changing all the time, and I'd love for you to get down there and see all the latest things. That said, we'll get right to the program here. Engine number 5 started out on the Lake Tahoe Railway. It was built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1875, and it was one of a number of steam locomotives that they used for hauling lumber and logs from the area along South Shore known as Glenbrook up to Spooner Summit, where the logs were offloaded and sluiced down into the Carson Valley. Is that correct, John? Something like that, Carson City, to be milled. And she ran there from 1875 up until the end of their operation, about 1898. And then, along with another locomotive, it was acquired by the Nevada County Narrow Gauge, very much in original condition, still a wood burner. And here it is on the Nevada City turntable, which is right along Railroad Avenue, just after you get off of Sacramento Street, about 1899. Another picture of it in Grass Valley, at the Grass Valley Depot. Still a wood burner, still in original condition with a big diamond stack, pulling first-class passenger trains. And 5 at that time was the heaviest locomotive on the Nevada County Narrow Gauge, and they kept it really busy with mixed and first-class passenger trains, freight, everything between Nevada City and Colfax. This picture probably dates in around 1903, 1904, somewhere like that. It also pulled the very popular picnic trains that ran out to Chicago Park, and they did several annual picnics each year. For the miners' union and the schools and the churches and so forth. Still a wood burner. This picture probably dates about 1905. As timber resources dwindled, the locomotives each had to be converted to burn oil. Wood was getting scarce, it was expensive, and took a long time to get it to the railroad. So one by one, they sent the locomotives down to Sacramento to be converted as oil burners, where they took the wood box out, put an oil tank in, changed the firebox a little bit, and it eliminated the big diamond stack. It was so prominent part of its profile. Here it is on a picnic train in Chicago Park, right after that conversion, probably about 1910 thereabouts. After 1915, it looked like this. It had the addition of air brakes and automatic couplers that were mandated by the government for safety. And you also look at the rippled iron work on the tender behind the engine. That was a result of the Grass Valley engine house fire of 1915, which nearly destroyed the engine. But they were able to get it right back into shape immediately, built a new cab for it and everything. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Going into the teens and 1920s, the engine just chugged right along. Still the heaviest locomotive on the narrow gauge, seen here in the Grass Valley yards, sometime probably in the 1920s. There were a lot of changes and revisions and little modifications done to it to keep it running. Here it is, Colfax, hauling Shell oil tank cars. The Twin Cities here had 4 fuel bulk plants, one of them Shell, another one Associated, Union Oil, and Standard Oil, all had bulk plants here, so they would get their fuel transferred from tank cars in Colfax, the standard gauge cars, into the narrow gauge cars, and they would haul it to the Twin Cities that way. They also hauled the fuel oil that was used in all the locomotives, which by 1910 were all converted to burn oil. And that was done at a place called Oilville, just this side of Colfax, where they would gravity feed the oil and the fuel from the tank cars on the Southern Pacific into the narrow gauge cars. Here's another picture of 5 about the mid-1920s, a different cab, a few little things, but basically a good stalwart performing engine. Another picture of it in Colfax, showing a passenger train with one of the boxcars modified for carrying produce. You know, we had a lot of orchards in the area, and we had packing houses and so forth, and they transported fresh fruit to the packing houses and then back to Colfax to be loaded onto Pacific Fruit Express refrigerated cars. So busy was engine number 5, and they loved it so much they wanted to keep it running. So in the late 1930s, they went back to Tahoe and they bought number 5's sister engine, the Glenbrook. And they brought it to Grass Valley, and they were only going to use it as a source of spare parts to keep 5 running. Thankfully, they didn't do that, and we're going to look at that again a little bit later. So the Glenbrook just kind of sat in the Grass Valley yards, still very much in original condition with the diamond stack, still a wood burner, and it never really was needed for spare parts. So when the railroad closed in 1942, it was shipped back to Tahoe for the Bliss family, put on display in Carson City, and you'll see a little bit more of its progress later on. 5, by the late 1930s, was looking pretty ragged. It had gone almost 40 years on the Nevada County narrow gauge, pulling freight and passengers and running the 23-mile line almost daily. It was augmented in the late 20s and early 30s by engines 7, 8, and 9, which were much heavier locomotives. So 5 was kind of relegated as a spare at that point, beginning about 1935. You can see the snow plow on the front there. So when it wasn't, since it was a spare engine, they put a plow on it, and they used it for plowing the tracks during snowstorms. And looking pretty ragged. But Johnny Nolan, the master mechanic, loved this engine. He kept it up, he kept it in working order. He didn't want it to be sold for scrap. And so as engine 7 and some of the others were scrapped, he commandeered the cab off of number 7, which was a nice solid steel cab, as opposed to the wood cabs. Other modifications were made. And he basically, that was his pet engine. And he kept it in the yards, and they used it sparingly, you know, as a stand-in locomotive. But by 1940, there was a pretty good-sized scrap drive. And some of you might remember Bob Payne, who was a Nevada City mayor and grew up around town here. Bob Payne had told me that the only way that he could see engine number 5 surviving the scrap drive is if he brokered a sale of it. And that opportunity came along with Universal Studios. They were looking for a movie engine for use in the John Wayne movie, The Spoilers. So Payne put together the deal with Johnny Nolan's approval, and the engine was sold and shipped to Universal Studios for use in the John Wayne movie, The Spoilers. It remained there and was used all the time on the studio backlot throughout the 1950s, 1960s, last being used in a Twilight Zone movie sometime in the mid-1970s. And if you want to visit the museum, John Christensen has collected virtually every movie poster that 5 has starred in. And we also have a lot of other photographs and some videotapes showing her as a star. And here she is in some of the other westerns. The movie The Great Race, the TV series Virginian, Heck Ramsey, Alias Smith and Jones, to name a few. And so somebody got a bright idea in the early 1980s. In 1983, Madeline Helling and Cliff Summerstrom and a handful of others put an ad in the paper wanting to form what they called the Transportation Museum Division of the Nevada County Historical Society. And the job was going to be, oh, let's gather some railroad artifacts and some old-timer stories and maybe augment the Firehouse Museum and the Pelton Wheel Museum with a nice dedicated display of the Nevada County narrow gauge, since it was such a prominent, had so much to do with the development of this area. Well, John Christensen came along and everything got out of control real fast. He said, no, we're not going to just stop there. I'm going to talk to Universal. I want engine 5 back here. And of course, he managed to sneak in a passenger car and a couple of freight cars and build a caboose in his own yard during that time. So we knew he was pretty serious. By 1985, John had successfully negotiated a museum loan of engine number 5. And with the help of Robinson Enterprises and a couple of their big trucks, we went to LA to grab the engine. And this is how we found it. Sitting pretty forlorn in the backlot at Universal Studios. That's John, believe it or not.
Yeah, 80 days.
Yeah. And we proceeded to load it and transport it back to Grass Valley. Robinson was very generous in loaning us the low boys. We built the rail ramps at the Sacramento Locomotive Works on the way down there, and we were able to just drop. You could see that truck off in the distance there. He was connected to a cable, which actually pulled the engine onto this trailer once we got the ramp built and got everything all situated. And that's very much how we move the engine today. So this is number 5's very first run, headed back to Grass Valley. This was in 1985. And we got her all loaded up on the trailer, and we were just getting ready to go. Some of our volunteers there's John, Earl Taylor, and Clyde Hill. Some of those folks aren't with us anymore. I wanted people to recognize it, so I brought down some paint and stencils, and we put the number 5 back on the cab again, and we painted the familiar roundel on the tender, just so that folks would recognize it when it got back to Nevada County. This is the Hollywood tender being loaded onto the second trailer. And the wheels and everything are off the original tender, but the rest of it was kind of Hollywood, kind of cheesy construction. You see the plywood oil tank up on top of the tender there. That departed somewhere on Highway 5 between Bakersfield and our rest stop, our next motel stop. And I would imagine they made a nice addition to some farmer's fence down there. This is the original number 5 tender, which we also picked up and brought home. And underneath the rust and the Hollywood paint, you can still make out the number 5 painted on there that it left Grass Valley with. Here's another side shot of that tender. Look very closely, right above the Hollywood garb there, and you can make out the NCNGRR roundel right in the center. And you can actually see 2 applications of that. So that's how it left Nevada County. So that said, we were all loaded up and ready to go. The engine weighed in at 27 tons. The tender was no problem. But there was a lot of mud and sludge inside the boiler that we didn't think of when we were calculating the weights. And so we were overweight, so we had to get special permits and a lot of extra paperwork from the Highway Patrol before we were allowed to take the engine up over the freeway in the Grapevine and make its way back to Nevada County.
We also opened the blowdown valve, and all the sludge poured out onto their...
CHP's parking lot. This is about a 4-hour delay. So we thought, okay, paperwork, and weight reduction and all that kind of thing. Finally, we were ready to come home. So we have both tenders, we have the engine, and we're getting ready to leave the Highway Patrol inspection station. We stopped off at the Sacramento Locomotive Works because the engine looked pretty bad. It had been sitting in the LA smog and the sludge and the rust and everything down there for a lot of years. So we took a steam cleaner to it, and the wheels were kind of the same color as the engine, so we went out and bought a couple cans of red spray paint just to highlight it a little bit, beautify it, and then we were back on the highway. It was wonderful bringing the engine up the highway, as nobody had cell phone cameras back then. But they would come up alongside, they would honk and shout, and off to the left there is the late Ron Sturgill, who had a museum in Grass Valley. He's on a tripod with a movie camera filming us as we're coming up the highway. So then we get to the Antelope way station. We pull into the way station. The highway patrol people immediately close the way station behind us. They tell us we can't go anywhere. And we're thinking, oh no. My driver, Rich DeBurn, he's going through his file, making sure he's got all of his I's dotted and T's crossed, the paperwork, he's going through everything. And the highway patrol's like, you know, what they closed behind us, what's going on? They must really want to inspect us. Well, they all came out with their cameras, and they kept us there for about a half an hour while they went all around the engine, taking pictures, never once approached the cab, never once asked for any of that paperwork. Spent 4 hours in LA getting it. So then we were back on the road and coming up Highway 49 along. Anyone who knew the engine was coming was out there waiting for us. We got a lot of applause and cheers and everything, because you have to understand, there were a lot of people still around in 1985 who remember this engine, who loved this engine. In fact, when she was sold to the movie studios in 1940, and the movie came out in 41 or 42, people crowded the Del Oro just to hear this engine, hear the whistle and see the bell, and see their movie star, you know, big time, down in Hollywood. With that, we pulled into Robinson Timber, a very successful trip, very well organized trip. And I had made up these cheesy banners in my living room a couple nights before we went down there. We hung them up there just to let people know it was engine number 5 coming home. That's Steve Coffey. He's one of our members from the past. And we had a big public reception at the Union newspaper out in the parking lot. And everybody came around. And it was just really joyous. Channel 3 was there. John Hart, I'm sure, was there. And it was just a wonderful reception. Honored were 5 of the surviving employees of the Nevada County Narrow Gauge. The one in the center being Bob Payne, who brokered the sale, which saved the engine in the first place. And so that was a big honor, as well as a lot of city and county government folks were, and Robinson and so forth. From there, we led a parade down Grass Valley. We had the Gilmore School Band leading the way, and people were honking and cheering and lining the roadway. And this is going along Main Street, Grass Valley, South Auburn Street, in front of the old Grass Valley Drugs that Dale Boothby used to own. And of course, we had to make this stop at the Nevada County Narrow Gauge passenger entrance on Bennett Street. The first time this engine had seen that spot since about 1940. From there, it was Nevada City, and I just remember a lot of people coming, storming out of their houses, some of them in walkers and wheelchairs, just in tears. They had ridden the picnic trains, they had gone to the railroad station to pick up newspapers to deliver, they had packed fruit that was loaded onto the narrow gauge, and to see this engine coming down the street was just overwhelming for me. Another thing that was overwhelming was the fact that we had a steam whistle rigged to the truck's braking system. And we were so exuberant in blowing that whistle coming down Broad Street that right after this picture was taken, we drained the air out of the brake system, the truck brakes locked up, and everybody you see standing on that trailer was on the ground. So there were no injuries, spent a few minutes charging the air back up, and got one hell of a lecture from the truck driver, never to do that again. And we were back on our way. From there, we took her to the Nevada City Corporation yard, where we kept it for a while and began to disassemble it and analyze what it would take to get it running. The old boiler that's on there was still in pretty good condition, but it was designed to burn propane because the movie studio didn't have a big use at that point to have a lot of steam pressure to pull a heavy train. They wanted to blow the whistle, generate some smoke, and run it back and forth in the back lot, you know, during filming the westerns, which was a short piece of track. So we began an analysis on what it would take to get it running. We were cutting flues out of it from inside the firebox, and kind of coming up with an idea of what it might take to get it steamable. And it was going to be a lot. We would have had to rebuild a lot. We didn't have the funding back then. And, but nonetheless, it always remained a long-term goal to get the engine firing again. So instead, we painted it up nice and pretty, put it on display down at the Northern Queen Motel, which was a very flourishing hotel at that point. The Northern Queen also was running a narrow gauge train using the former Argent Lumber Company engine number 5. And it was a track that we had loaned them, that we had gotten from the Union Pacific. And they built pretty much all of the track that is in the meadow down there that you ride the rail bus through right now during that time. And they were running this locomotive and a couple of restored flat cars into excursion cars, and then we had also loaned them and stored our equipment there. And they had a really good operation during the early 1990s. Number 5, in the meantime, was on display. The green paint kind of started to fade with the weather and all that kind of thing. So in addition to the paint and the beautification, we also cast brand new builder's plates and a star plate for it. We borrowed the builder's plate from Nevada County number 1, which was in the John Straka collection. We cast it, an aluminum version of it at Litton Engineering Labs, and then we ground down the numbers, and then we hand carved out of wood number 5's numbers, put it back on there, cast it in bronze, and that's how we got the builder's plates. The star plate in the front, we borrowed the original star plate from the Glenbrook engine in Nevada and brought it down here, made a pattern out of it, and we cast the brand new star plate for engine number 5. Time goes on, a little bit more weathering. We decided to paint the engine black, which is pretty much what it looked like during the late 1930s. This is almost exactly how it looked before it left for Universal Studios. And in addition to having it on display, we also paraded it around a few times, some 4th of July parades, parked it at the fairgrounds. Here you got some of the very prominent founding members of the day. Of course, Donna Christensen, Bob Austin, Madeline Helling, Dick Rohrman, John Christensen, Ken Yo, and Al and Marilyn Dittman. And they were the movers and shakers. They kept the museum going, kept 5 in the forefront, and did a lot of the car restoration. For a time, we also took it over to Colfax and put it on display, all beautified, and that's John's caboose he built in his yard, sitting there behind it. We probably spent about 3 or 4 months there. Yeah. And when it wasn't being displayed or paraded, it certainly became the #1 showpiece in our brand new museum built right down here on Ghost Avenue. And there was an announcement made, or somebody got wind of this incredible steam-up event that was going to take place at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City. And they were getting all of the surviving steam locomotives on the West Coast. Pre-1900, John?
Yeah.
And they had like a dozen of them. And Nevada County Narrow Gauge 5's sister engine, the Glenbrook, was already restored and it was going to be there. Another great, bright idea from John is, I want to be steaming alongside the Glenbrook. I want 5 going and steaming along the Glenbrook. And there's no arguing with it. So we hauled the engine out of the museum, back down to the shop, and stripped it completely down to the frame and the wheels. We had acquired a new boiler for it. It was actually a boiler that was built for the Glenbrook about 20 years ago, but it was dimensionally wrong for what you would call a concourse restoration. Some of the mounting holes and things like that were not correct for the Glenbrook, so it was put up for sale back in the 80s. And the Glenbrook had a completely brand new boiler manufactured. So we got that boiler. And so now what do you do with the frame? We have no idea what the running gear is going to be like, with the bearings, the rods, the mechanism inside, the cylinders. The tender was a pretty easy rebuild. Repair the water tank, repair the oil tank, and get it ready. And it was all ready to go pretty early on. That's the original oil tank after repairs being mounted back into the tender. But the engine, we didn't know what kind of shape it was in. So off came the side rods and inspections of all the all the various parts. Dan Lloyd here can talk to you a lot more about that later on. And thank God we had him join our museum, him and Dana and Randy and a few others here that you're going to see. Dan took this project on and saw it to completion, and no details were left undone. The engine was, raised up so that we could get underneath it, do inspections, do repairs, timing of the wheels and the drivers, inspection and repair of all that internal mechanism. And virtually everything, every inch of that locomotive was gone through. The wheels were dropped, the bearings, maybe they were replaced, maybe they were just inspected. Dan can tell you more about that later. But it was absolutely, completely stripped down.
Tim, what year is this?
This is year before, this last year actually. Yes, this all happened, everything happened within a year.
That's why they were made, remade.
Yeah, and that was, what a miracle that was. The boss himself got involved, and you have to clean and detail all of these bearing surfaces, because that's what the side rods go on with bronze bushings, and a lot of pressure from the steam and so forth. So we basically got in there and just hand scrubbed everything, got it all the way down to as close to bare metal as we could. They had to check the timing of the wheels, make sure that they were timed properly, so that you wouldn't have rod knocking and everything like that. And we talked about that old propane firebox, which was not going to work in the new boiler. Dan built an entirely new firebox from scratch, and it was fitted into the frame before we dropped the boiler back in. Everything from scratch. And I never thought I would ever learn so much about fireboxes other than a place where you built a fire. This is a very sophisticated and efficient firebox, as it turns out. So once that was installed, next concern we had was the cylinders. Were they in shape to handle that amount of steam pressure? We had no idea what they looked like inside, whether they were going to be cracked, the pistons cracked, or the rings shot, and everything. And so we stripped them all the way down, and of course we found some wear. Dan and Amy Trago, who was another very dedicated member who, along with Dan and Chad, worked tirelessly on this engine to get it in shape. Dan built from scratch a cylinder home that you put on a fixture and hook it up to a drill motor, and was able to completely hone those cylinders out to get them nice and round again, so that when you put piston rings and all that kind of thing back on, you had some hope of holding pressure and generating power. At the same time, one of our members came up with this air-actuated back and forth lapping machine, which...
Nevada State's loaned that to us.
Oh, they did? Okay, Nevada State Railroad.
They used it on the Glenbrook.
Gotcha. And so what that did is spend all day going back and forth with maybe a 320 or 400 grit lapping compound, lapping in the forward and reverse valve that actuates the cylinders. And that would just take care of itself while everybody else was busy doing their chores. So we had the cylinders apart, and looking every tip to toe, everything was done on that engine. You see Amy down in there working on the bearings and cleaning and scraping and inspecting. And she was poking her head through the top of the, she kind of lived there, I think, for about a month. We would bring her food, peanuts, and things like that. And there she is. She was a brand new volunteer. Nobody knew much about her, didn't know her that well, but boy, what a hard worker. And like I said, every attention to detail from all the members was done. Here she is right before the cylinders went back together. And this is the new boiler getting ready to be put on. This was probably about a week before it was fitted back onto the engine, where you see it here. And from there, with the boiler and the firebox in place, and all the underpinnings inspected and replaced, it was time to actually start putting the engine back together. And for us, just doing this was a milestone. Look at that, we got a boiler on wheels, and the rail bus riders would cheer and everything. For me personally, but it wasn't going to stop there with these guys. So now what to do with all the rest of the parts that we had gathered, and was Dan and Amy, you know, one by one, getting all the piping and the fixtures and the domes and everything put back on. Once some of that was done, we would pressure test the boiler to make sure it had integrity and to make sure our accessories had integrity, being able to hold, you know, 150, 200 pounds of pressure. That was all very successful with a lot of tweaks. Then came the assembly of the cab, the various fittings, throttle, and lots of piping for the brake system, the control system. All of that, you know, as much as we could do before putting the cab back on the locomotive. And then once that was done, another monumental moment. Look at that, we have a boiler in the cab on engine 5, and you know, that was a big hoorah. But it wasn't going to end there, not according to this guy anyway. So work progressed, and as motivated as we were to get the engine running, we had deep concerns about making sure we could get it stopped. So the entire braking system was redone. We rebuilt the brake cylinders and all the brake mechanism. New hardware were necessary. And it was tested with air pressure and so forth to make sure it was going to function. More work with the cab on, with piping and cylinders and all those things. This is the cab coming together even more with the throttle in place and some of the brake piping and fittings and so forth. There's the firebox. And the engine was actually starting to finally look like an engine. The sand dome is back on, the electric generator, the bell, and that's Chad up on top there, you know, putting together the rest of the steam dome, which is the brain center of the steam locomotive. That's where the steam is, pressure gathers and is vectored to the cylinders and everything to the whistle and through the cab and all that kind of thing. And by about, what was it, May of last year, we actually had a complete steam locomotive coupled to the tender that we were ready to test. The volunteers were anxious and excited, and they loved the cosmetic process, with, you know, progress that we had made, but now they were ready for steam. So Dan, after Amy put the whistle and the rest of the valves back on the top, Dan kicked the tires and lit the fires, and from there it was just kind of sit back and see what happens. And pressure came up. We watched everything. We walked around and checked on everything to make sure everything was coming up. The boiler warmed up beautifully, and pretty soon we had steam. And within about another 10 minutes, we had a whole lot of steam. And so things were looking really good, but we had a lot of leaks and a lot of this and that, you know, that we had to go back and tweak on. You can see the glow from the firebox down on the ground there. And so everything was functioning really good, but it needed a lot of little tweaks. But nothing like you would expect from such a big enterprise. So finally, we were able to go. We made several chugs out of the shop onto the main yard tracks, back and forth, back and forth. The engine was performing beautifully. And so John had the honor of actually flattening the first pennies for everybody as the engine rolled back and forth to everyone's delight. And then we got really brave and decided to take it down into the meadow area, down into the woods. All of our concerns about the cylinders went away real fast. That engine has a lot of power. And pretty much the same kind of power it was originally designed for, logging, you know, in the mountains up in Tahoe. Very responsive, very little throttle to get it moving, and it was just a joy to see it going back and forth down in the forest there. I tried as best I could on the low shutter speed to make it look like we were doing 60 miles an hour here. We were just creeping. So we made several runs up and down there, and it was just a beautiful sight. It was really an accomplishment. And of course, it took a lot of fuel to do that. We ran out of fuel a number of times. Not because we ran out of fuel, but because coming up that steep grade from the valley up to the museum, all the fuel would slosh to the back of the tender, and it would cut off the supply to the engine, so we would flame out. And in order to augment that, thankfully, again, Robinson's to the rescue, came down with a fuel truck, and we loaded her up with another couple hundred gallons of number 2 diesel, I guess. and we were able to light the fire again and chuck it back on up the hill. We steamed it over to the loading area just to make sure we could get it there, to put it on the truck to take to Carson City. But you know, that engine is exactly how it looked when it left here, you know, in 1940. In fact, it's probably even a lot cleaner and better here than it was then. So Robinson, in the same fashion, our crew, led by Dana Milner, built another ramp and got it all ready to load up using both locomotives. We pulled it down from the museum, and Dan and Dana and those guys shoved it back up onto the trailer, barely fit onto the trailer, and chained it down really good. And in no time, we were all ready to head up to Carson City. The drive up Highway 20, and the tender went on the second trailer. It went the following, it actually went the week ahead of the locomotive. Driving it up there was a real spectacle. Here we are going past the kiosk that we placed at Railroad Avenue alongside the flat car. And this locomotive is actually on the narrow gauge railroad bed, you know, where the Nevada City Depot once stood. And so here she is getting on the freeway and a beautiful scenic drive up Highway 20. We had a lot of onlookers and a lot of people just really admiring it. John demanded I take pictures of it going by anything that had Tahoe written on it. Because the locomotive was named the Tahoe and the sister engine was named the Glenbrook. So we've got it going past Lake Tahoe, some more beautiful road trip scenes. And here we are with the locomotive entering the state of Nevada for the first time since 1899 when it left Nevada coming to California. Going through the Carson Valley on its way to Carson City, we arrive at the Carson City Museum and reverse the process to unload it. The people there were very appreciative and very amazed at what we did. And huzzah. Reunited with the country. And y'all have this man to thank. You know, the volunteers did all the work, but without his vision, you know, we would have never got there. And that was a vision that's been consistent since 1983, and it's been a labor of love for everybody involved, a good many of them not with us anymore, since 1985. And so, personally, I walk around the railroad and well up every now and then when I see something like this. And it is a huge accomplishment, thanks to these guys. And so we have the Glenbrook and the Tahoe sitting together once again. But that's not where it all ended. Dan couldn't wait to light another fire, ended up in the middle of Nevada, and off we were. We were up there with, it was over 25 other locomotives, about a dozen of them all running. And we steamed alongside. They have a beautiful loop track that goes around the whole museum. And we played and played and played. And all the volunteers who had worked on the locomotive got their turn at the throttle and firing and so forth. We also brought Les Wilmander's little 1889 Porter locomotive up there, and we were able to steam the two together. If you live around Nevada City, you'll hear a steam whistle about once or twice a month. It's usually the Porter going up and down the meadow, in addition to engine number 5, which we're going to be doing a lot more of in the future. She looks beautiful. She ran beautiful. She's powerful. And you know, with all these ornate, factory perfect brass and polished, beautiful locomotives from the V&T and so forth that were there, everybody had an extra special feeling for number 5, because she's like the daughter that left home at 15 and decided to come back when she was 35. And boy, did she have a story to tell. So she had everybody's attention. And we couldn't wait. This was another monumental pose. Nevada City in 1899, and on the turntable in Carson City in 2022. But we just wanted to play. So we played and played and played. Here's engine 5 and the Glenbrook going along behind her, both under steam during this event. What you have here, this isn't one of those retirement things that they do for airliners. This was a demonstration of a steam fire engine that was going on in the background. And so they were spraying water over the top as we were going. But that didn't stop anything. We wanted to play. And that's one of the B&T locomotives coming up behind during the pageant that was going on up there. Another shot on the turntable with another B&T engine. Some runs down into the trees, back and forth. She ran so beautifully. And Dan fired and ran and just kept everything going. And then we all kind of waiting our turn, took turns out in the forest down there with, pictures, and we all got to run. And we all applauded one another. She was beautiful. She was better than any of us ever expected. And the crowd really loved her. People from all over the country came to this event. This was a one-of-a-kind event. And 5 got one big applause. And this was some of the other locomotives that were there. All of them museum pieces, all of them running. And it was just a real joyous event. It was kind of like the 1800s version of the launching of a space shuttle. It was just monumental. But she was hungry and thirsty all the time. So if we wanted to play, we were always having to stop for water and oil. But play we did.
You earned it.
This is another picture of her alongside the Glenbrook. That's John over there. John was up at the crack of dawn every morning, putting oil in the journal boxes, wiping things clean, making sure everything was going good. As was Dan Lloyd in the cab, firing, watching the pressure, getting everything ready. Liz was over there. She was doing a lot of the preparatory maintenance, running sometimes. Amy was there. Chad was there. So these are the 3 big players that we need to recognize for this. Dan Lloyd came to the museum just to want to be a part of it. He was a retired, well, I'll let him tell you at some point. But he is the main dynamo that grabbed this project by the antlers and just drove it all the way home. He and John. Amy Trudeau was by his side doing all the heavy work. She works me and most of the other people under the table. Practically lived at the museum, doing everything, and while being an apprentice, learning machining, getting underneath, turning big wrenches, polishing, doing all the things to augment Dan. A lot of our steam knowledge came from this man, Chad Gadecki. He's not only a very accomplished machinist, but also a steam nut. He hand-built little mini steam boilers that he powered different things with. He built a steam tractor, which was about this high and so long, and that he drove around. And so he was a real steam enthusiast. And when you paired him up with Dan and Amy, this project, like I said, like John was saying, it was bare axles less than a year ago. And we actually fired it and got up to Carson City with maybe not even a day or 2 to spare. Because of these guys. And of course, all the other volunteers, everybody pitched in to make this happen. And so that's our big hoorah the first day that we steamed it up. Now today, since coming back from Carson City, the locomotive is back in the shop. We're going to put the jacketing on it. So before we do that, we have this complex puzzle of insulation brick, which gets lined all the way around the boiler and banded. And while that's going on, the templates are being made up for the actual jacketing that's going to go around that insulation, and that's going to, in essence, complete the restoration of the locomotive. And from there, we'll probably put some brass banding or something on there to make it beautiful again. And probably within a couple of months here, it'll be complete and fired up and back on the tracks. And this is another picture I kind of like to show. That's the Glenbrook and the number 5 in Grass Valley in 1937. the two of them are again in Carson City in 2022. And so that's how she left Grass Valley in 1940, and that's how she looks today. So I want to finish this with our vintage wanted poster that we just unearthed. Wanted volunteers for our museum. We have openings for docents, machinists, woodworkers, gift shop sales, history preservation, track workers, and a lot more. And the reward is incredible. You get a great education. Every weekend is an adventure. You meet some of the most incredible craftsmen and just general people that you'd ever meet. And we run the trains, we drive spikes by hand, we lay track, we turn wrenches, we get dirty, everything is heavy. But boy, what a great and rewarding opportunity it is. And there's nothing like it. And it's the closest thing you're going to get to how our grandparents produced things around the turn of the century. So I think that's about all I have. And that's it. What do you guys think? We have Dan Lloyd, Dana Milner, John, and Randy stand up. They're with us all the time. They're some of the ones who make this work happen. And I would very much encourage you to come. If you've already been to the museum, keep coming. Things are changing all the time. And we're getting we're getting another passenger coach on Sunday. And how many cars have you driven home? I'm going to turn it over to John, and thank you all for coming. It's always
How many of the other trains at that convention were built by amateurs?
Probably none of them. I mean, all the locomotives you saw at Carson City were built by experienced people. We were, we just decided to take that engine apart and put it back together again. And we just didn't know what kind of problems we were going to run into.
Even more amazing that you guys could do it.
Exactly. And I think the fact that we got the engine up there, a lot of people said there's no way, because they saw the engine all apart, a few months earlier. But we got there, a week early before the event, and which allowed us some track time so we could practice running the engine on their loop, because they did have a grade there at a certain point, so we had to learn how to throttle up and throttle down and use the brakes properly and whatnot. But we all were fast learners. Any questions?
Yeah. Several, but I guess the first one I have is, who certified the boiler? Did the government get involved, or the
State of California.
State of California?
Yeah, they have a boiler division, and they generally inspect like stationary boilers, old plant boilers and things like that. And but a few locomotives. The inspector that we had was relatively new. He came up and he inspected the porter, and then he also then inspected ours, and we were pretty nervous about the whole thing. But we had to fill up the boiler. We heated it up to probably about 90 degrees, and worrying about leaks and this and that. Then we had to do a hydrostatic pressure on it, and we brought it up. Normally it runs about at 130 pounds when it's operating, Well, we ran it up to about 190, you know, and then he goes, cut.
You didn't expect for cracks or something?
Yeah, just leaks or mainly the boiler, you know, and leaking around the tubes, you know, that's what they're looking for. But we had a few little dribbles here and there, and as the boiler heats up, you have expansion, and a lot of that goes away. And also, as we use the boiler more frequently, you get a little bit of a natural rust, you know, and so a lot of that goes away, particularly when you heat up the engine.
When you shut it down, you have to do it slowly so nothing cracks?
No, we just let it just cool off naturally, yes.
And does the water get into the pistons, into the cylinders?
No,
So they don't run?
they're not, no. No, it's just steam pressure from the steam dome, and then you have a long tube that goes from the steam dome to the front of the boiler, and that's where the superheated steam transits, and then there's what they call a branch pipe. It goes down, one on each side, down to the cylinders.
You can get parts like piston rings and pistons, or they all machine?
Well, we had a broken ring, and so we ordered the ring from a company called Niagara in New York, and so they made the ring, and then we had to machine it to fit, and once we had our rings properly fitted, we didn't have any problems.
And I'm asking too many questions. I don't. Is the light carbide?
Pardon me?
Is the headlamp carbide?
No, and we didn't have the lamp running. We were going to hook up the electrical. That's one of the other things we need to do. The cap, we have the old style cap lights, and I just got the Ohio National cap switch for it, which is an old vintage switch.
But was it ever carbide, the big headlamp?
Not that I'm aware of. No.
Amazing.
How did you load the boiler back onto into its place, and how much does it weigh?
Well, the engine's about 26 tons, you know, and a little heavier when it's got the water in it. Yeah, so, and say again, did I answer?
How did you get it back up on the wheels? The engine?
Oh, well, we have a hoist, and then the guys developed a method to, what we did is we bolted an I-beam to the back of the boiler, and then had jacks, and as we brought the back end up, we brought the front end up with the hoist and chain, because that's the light end. And once we got it up high enough, then we just we rolled the chassis underneath it, and then very carefully lowered it down. So, yeah, it's a process. Twice we did that, because, you know, in the photo here, we did a pre-fitting to make sure the boiler, everything would match up, and everything did match up. You know, when years before this, I was trying to get that boiler, but people always said, well, it won't fit. You know, they made a big error on it, it won't fit. You know, and so finally I went up there. We did some laser sightings on our boiler and chassis and all the attachment points. And then I went up there and measured everything, and I said, well, that boiler's gonna fit, you know. And I remember the curator, he said, really? He said it wouldn't fit. Anyway, what happened was when the boiler was designed, the person at the Nevada State Railroad Museum back in the very early 80s, when they did the drawings, made a mistake on the transition, which is the section of the boiler where you see it go up between the sand dome and the steam dome, that little rise. And it was set up about 3 inches higher than it should have been, and so it ruined, they didn't want to use that boiler because it would not be an accurate 1875 restoration, which is what they were going for. And so, but for us, it was not a problem. And plus, their cab sits much lower, the original ash cab on it. And so it would have thrown the windows out of proportion and everything. But with ours, with that steel cab, it really didn't affect anything. We just made a little bit of a higher cut on it, and you can't even tell. And then all the attachment points fit. We have a little shorter firebox, so we designed the fire can to be about 4 inches higher. And everything fit perfectly once we put it together.
The smoke box hit perfect.
Yeah, the smoke box, we cut the original smoke box off the other boiler, and it telescoped on it just perfectly. With hardly any room, probably a 3/8 of an inch. So, which was the best thing that happened.
What do you estimate the top speed of this?
Oh,
Give me some straight track and I'll tell you.
yeah, I know. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
I heard some of them pretty fast.
well, yeah, that engine, we have a 6% grade as we come up right to where the shop is, and then it levels out. And that engine's got so much power, I mean, it just walked up that with no problem.
We were afraid it wouldn't make it.
Yeah, I know, we were worried about it, and it just took off like a bat.
Made it up a quarter throttle.
So when are we gonna be able to ride on it up the museum or in the meadow?
What's probably, well, I don't know about ride on it, but I mean, we do have rides. Probably next summer.
Watch it then, yeah.
The engine's gonna go into the museum in January, and it'll stay in there during the winter. And then in May, we're planning to bring it out at least once a month and steam it up. We're planning to steam it up in December. Dan doesn't know this. Anyway, for a sound study. Maybe December, or it could be early January for a sound study that we have to do for the environmental review.
That's the run down the Railroad Avenue. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I can. What we're doing is, what we're working on is extending the track a half mile to the end of Railroad Avenue to Sacramento Street. You know where the Chevron gas station is?
Yeah.
So, and that's the original right-of-way. And so we'll come up off the Northern Queen. We've already got that area opened up. The trees are gone. And we're working on what they call a CEQA document for the city of Nevada City, which is a limited environmental impact review. And so hopefully by February, we should have that completed. And then once it's completed, then we can go to the city council and to get approval to go to planning. So that's where we're at right now. So and the track will be like streetcar track in the road. So people can drive on it when it's not in use.
Thank you, John and Tim. Appreciate it.